Hello, everyone. We're going to wait for 2 minutes for the session to begin while other people join. So stick around and we'll be initiating in a moment.
Hello, and welcome everyone to this panel as part of the Code for All Summit this year. My name is Lina Patel, and I'll be hosting this conversation around power dynamics in a large distributed network, and specifically we're talking about power dynamics within the Code for All network. I am joining you from Melbourne in Australia. It's quite late at night, and we'll be introducing the other panelists in a minute. Because I'm joining you from Australia, I want to open with a protocol that we have here, which is the acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And yeah, I'm very happy that I get to work in a place that has the oldest living continuous culture in the world. So you've signed up to hear a little bit more about power, a little bit about power dynamics, and a little bit about how this kind of plays out in this excellent network that I imagine some of us are a part of, the Code for All network. I would love to know where you're joining us from. So as we're going around, and I'll give my rest of the panel a chance to introduce themselves. Please jump in the chat and let us know where you are joining us from. Make sure on the chat you have selected the everyone option so that everybody can see that. As we go around, we've got the Code for All core team here to talk about their experience with this work that we did. Lauren, Sophia, Nonso. I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourself in terms of your name, where you're located, how you're connected into Code for All, and I would love to hear from each of you. What is your superpower? What is one thing you can do that you imagine you're pretty good at doing? And we'll round off this section with me introducing myself. So Lauren, would you like to get us going?
Yeah, hi, I'm Lauren, and I'm one of the co-directors at Code for All. I'm currently based in Jordan, and as a co-director at Code for All, my main focuses are on communications, team building, and I also lead our support squads program. I got into Code for All. I initially was involved with Code for America and with Code for Australia, and it was through Code for Australia that I found out about Code for All. My superpower. I really like taking sort of like complex ideas and trying to boil it down into a way that's really easy to understand, and also try to do it in like a fun way with illustrations and things like that.
Thank you, Lauren. I've had the great pleasure of having an article written by Lauren after she attended a workshop I ran in Melbourne, and very marvelous illustrations as part of that blog post on the Tech for Non-Tech program. Sophia, where are you? What's your superpower?
I have to say that I thought of two superpowers. One is my social intelligence. I'm really good at socializing. And my other one is I'm really good at cooking and baking. I think that's also a superpower. Yeah, the way to the heart is through the stomach. So yeah, and well, I'm gonna quickly introduce myself. I'm Sophia. I'm in Mexico City. It's very early for me too. And I'm co-directing the network along with Lauren. We have been together for quite a while, 3 years now, I think. And I was initially part of Codeando Mexico for a few years, or Code for Mexico. And in the network, what I mostly do is I deal with some admin processes with funders and with the different communities of practice that we have.
Perfect. Thank you, Sophia. Nonso, where are you at?
Thank you so much, Lena. Hi, everyone. I am Nonso. I'm based in Abuja, Nigeria. I at Code for All, which is it's a wonderful team to be a part of. I play the role of a fundraising and partnership manager. Yeah, so basically helping cover the grounds around how we engage with our members of the network and also external partners, and a bit of the fundraising work as well. In terms of superpower, I think of mine as a bit of two-way street, because for me, it comes across as listening as my superpower, but I think people often perceive it as thoughtfulness. So I don't know how that works. I just think that I'm great at listening, but then people just come back and say, oh, you're very thoughtful. I'm like, okay, I hear you. So yeah, that's it.
I love how meta that became, because even your response to that comment is one of thoughtfulness. Thank you all so much. I'm Lina Patel, as I mentioned, joining you from Melbourne, Australia. I continue to be part of the Code for Australia community, having been part of the base team there for 2.5 years. And I work as a facilitator, a collaboration designer, and specifically for this work we want to showcase, I had the great pleasure of working as a strategy consultant with the Code for All core team to do this work we're going to share with you. And my superpower, actually, Nonso, I was thinking I was going to say listening, but then you said, I'm like, oh, you are very good at listening. So yeah, my superpower is probably noticing the subtle things, or noticing the things which might be just a little bit out of sight, and bringing people's attention to it. And it was sort of having an opportunity to bring that particular superpower to the Code for All network and team, which led to some very interesting discoveries, which we're going to share with you. Before we go on, I just want to say hello to those of you who are joining us on this sort of webinar format live. Hello, Sonia in Berlin, Joe here in Nam in Melbourne, Ruth from Canada, Ma, who's also part of the Code for All core team, joining us from Mexico, Alokwem, welcome back, Nigeria, Penella from Sweden, Teresa from Czechia. Thank you all for joining us. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. Let's get these slides going. Okay, so just where are we going to go in this conversation? So we'll start with a little bit of a backstory on this project, and we can hear from each of the team members who were involved what the context was of what was going on for them as we went into this sort of strategy project. Then we're going to just share a little bit about what was discovered as we were doing this strategy work, and then what came out of the work that we did and the outcomes for the network, and particularly the sort of angle in on power. So just to, I'll just sort of start and give you a quick backstory, and then would love to hear from Lauren and Sophia as you were both involved in the actual project. So what the work was, and it began late in 2019, but we really sort of kicked off in March 2020. And the work was really around creating a strategy for the Code for All core team to help them kind of set a direction for themselves. So at the time that when we met, they were quite a new team. And, you know, that's the sort of thing you do as a new team, is like form up a strategy to work out where you're going to go next. It happened to coincide with a fairly major event, which was that the pandemic was arriving on everyone's doorsteps. And so at the time, the core team, we had one person in Berlin, Kelly, who has since moved on. Sophia was in Mexico City at the time. Lauren was located in Tasmania, and I was just north of Lauren in Melbourne. So here we are in this like completely unprecedented moment in time, and we're trying to form a strategy to work out some sort of direction for the team. This was the challenge that kind of set us off. And I'll read this out. How might the Code for All core team, as a distinct and separate member of the Code for All network, identify, initiate, and efficiently implement changes to the network that reflect the needs of a wider range of members? So I'll just read that out again. How might the Code for All core team, so the 3 people who were involved at the time, as a distinct and separate member of the Code for All network, identify, initiate, and efficiently implement changes to the network that reflect the needs of a wider range of members? So that was the place we kind of started on paper. I would love to hear from you, Lauren, and from you, Sophia. What was going on for you? What was the context for you as we kind of started this work?
I can start if you want. It was really funny when you said like this tiny major event called the global pandemic, where we're still on there. So who would have thought of it at that moment? Yeah, I think, well, you mentioned it. Well, the pandemic was, at least for me, the pandemic was a thing. Also, I think by that time we were all working part-time. We weren't there full-time. So I personally was still collaborating with Codeando Mexico. And when the pandemic started, like it really kind of like everything exploded, you know, and we were in a crisis of like responding to everything. So it was, for me, it was a mixture of being in a crisis of responding to what the network needed, and members starting to demand also a bit more engagement. They wanted us to do certain things around COVID. We started to also thinking about what can we do, having conversations around, okay, where should we move forward from this? Everything has changed. Also, we were planning at that moment to have like our summit, our in-person summit. So it was also like reflecting on, okay, what do we do now with this? And for me, at the same time, it was the challenge of, in my country, what can we do? What can I do particularly also as a member of Go for Mexico? What are we going to do? What are we going to implement? So that became more like the priority also, like, okay, what's happening in my context, in my city, and how can I also contribute to that? And yeah, I think that was really challenging. It was really, really challenging. And I think also another thing that related to context is that we were all a new team. I was recently new. Lauren had joined, I think, a month or 2 months earlier than me, and Kelly was also like new in the team. So we were still like figuring out our personalities and our way of working. And yeah, and that also bring another challenge to all of the work that we were doing.
Thanks, Sophia. So lots of demands on your attention, both as a core team and then also on you as a concerned citizen, as an active and concerned citizen in the place that you live. Lauren, what was the context for you when this work kicked off a year and a bit ago?
Yeah, in addition to some of those things that Sophia mentioned, one big thing I think was that we felt like we didn't really understand how the decision making worked, and how, like, where we were able to make decisions and we weren't in our roles. And so that made it kind of hard to set the direction in general. So I think we felt like we were kind of just like coming up with ideas and just like doing it without having a lot of direction to help guide us. And so that's what I was most excited for when we started the project.
Excellent. So new team, wondering what you've just arrived in. Yeah, it makes sense that a strategy might be something you might reach for. So we began, and what the work actually involved were weekly workshops. So we met once a week for 12 or 13 weeks for about 90 minutes. And we managed to find a time that worked for all of us. And we basically just, the four of us, Kelly, Lauren, Sophia, and myself, we rocked up and we'd have these discussions. And it's kind of impossible to rely on any strategy work processes in a pandemic, because none of the assumptions around the present or the future actually exist. Like you just literally don't know how things are going to turn out. So we took quite a meandering sort of discussion sort of approach, and we discovered some interesting things along the way. So yeah, Sophia and Lauren, I would love to hear from you. Could you share what were some of your wow moments, or what was your, or singular wow moment on this project as we were kind of trying to find a way towards your new future?
I'll go first this time. Yeah, there were a lot of wow moments. I would say one definitely was your observation, Lena, that our network members are sort of exist to challenge the status quo, but the interactions we were seeing with network members reflected the status quo. And I think in your final report, you put it as like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, with referring to how sort of civic tech is born from the tech sector. And so whether we want to or not, we see a lot of the same inequities in civic tech that we see in tech. So that was a big one for me. And I think another one that sort of like relates to that was your observation that the current Code for All structure isn't really fit for purpose. And I think that kind of relates to that, because we sort of looked at how the current structure is sort of like a very standard structure that you might see in a lot of like big companies and organizations, where we have a board and an executive committee, and there's a lot of processes to go through to make decisions. But at the same time, we're like this dynamic, innovative network that needs to adapt quickly and make decisions fast. And so sort of seeing along that whole thread of like, there's this idea of civic tech and Code for All and how we're doing things. And then there's sort of like these other realities that don't really match up.
Yeah, great. And thanks for sharing that, Lauren. And so there was, just this like really distinct thing where you needed to be fast and agile and responsive, but the actual structures, the kind of organization structure that you had all walked into was a little more, there was a few more steps you needed to go through in order to respond. Sophia, what were your wow moments?
Before I say my wow moments, I have to say that I love the fact that Lauren and I always think on the same things. Because one of the things that I wrote down in my notes as my first wow moment was like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Yeah, so but that was one thing for me, like acknowledging that the dynamics that are existing in the tech ecosystem are part of the civic tech ecosystem, and that means that the inequities and the power dynamics that they are in the tech ecosystem are going to be replicating also there too. And we tend to think that because it's a civic tech, no, there's no inequalities, or there's no power dynamics, or there's no, because it's like a civic thing, right? But the reality is that it doesn't work that way. And the other thing that for me was a wow thing, and it still is the idea of the source. I think that opened my mind to a lot of things. Realizing, because I think when I understood the idea of the source and the idea on the power and relation that source still has in the network, in projects, and in the way we take decisions, that allowed me to make peace with the fact that I could also propose changes. I don't know, I think at the beginning I felt like I was there to just to listen and act according to like what people wanted it and what things were already set, you know? And we had a lot of anxiety around the governing structure, for example. We had a lot of anxiety around, we didn't really know how to move forward with things. And we were seeing things that weren't really like functioning. But at the same time, at least I didn't feel that I had the power to propose something different, because I wasn't there from the beginning. I was new to the team. I was like the newest member there. So it was like, okay, how can I propose things, or I just need to act on things as they are now? So I think understanding the source allowed me to say, okay, this is not working, and I can propose things, and I can also challenge the source power, because many of the people who were the source are not there anymore. So why don't we just like get rid of, you put something on the report, I don't remember the exact words, but said something like shedding the old shell is growing, or something among those lines. So yeah, it's like we need to move forward from that. And for me, that meant like understanding that I do have power, even though I'm not part of like the source of many of the things.
Could you say, could you explain a little bit more on that concept of source? I'm not sure if people would be familiar with it. I mean, I've shared something in the chat, but I would love to hear in your words, what is this concept of source that we were working with?
It's like kind of like the first person who takes the risk on an idea and who puts like the first stepping stone, because I don't know, Lauren and I can talk and have conversations around, I don't know, project. And the moment we start taking that first step and start putting like that first risk on moving forward, that's the way we become the source of things, right? Because we can have the idea and we can talk about an idea, but never to move forward with it. Or I don't know, maybe like in the initial conversations, there are 3 people having an idea, and at the end, only one moves forward, and it's only the one who's doing the work. So like that first step and that first like risk, it's kind of like the idea on the source concept.
Yeah, great. And what we discovered was that the person who was the source on a lot of this idea still kind of had some sort of power. They had some sort of influence, even though they weren't very directly present in the team and in the your governance structure. And so you kind of had these forces, these different source they were kind of a force that was acting on the team and making it either easier or more challenging for the three of you as new people to progress.
Yeah, and it wasn't something, I'm just going to compliment you here, it wasn't something so explicit, you know, it wasn't that they were saying, oh, you cannot do this, or you should move this. It was just this feeling that you weren't owning things, so you weren't able to change them.
Perfect. Thank you. Great. Thank you for sharing those. And both of you mentioned perfectly, and this was not at all scripted, both of you mentioned one of those observations. So just for context, we prepared a report on this work where we distilled down 10 observations. So there were 10 things in these 3 months of working together, 10 things we noticed about what was going on in the network that were, in essence, these kind of forces which were making it easier or harder for the team to find direction. So the interesting thing out of this whole strategy project was like we didn't exactly come up with a strategy that said do A, B, C, D, because the world was still in flux. What we did come up with was, here are the things in the landscape which you might need to be mindful of. Whatever direction you take, these obstacles or these enablers or challenges exist. So how are you going to actually navigate around these obstacles or work with these enablers to do whatever you seek, you end up doing? So that first wow moment you both mentioned, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I had a lot of fun coming up with the headlines for these observations. That led you to seek out some additional work. And I think this is where Nonso joins our story. So Nonso, how did you kind of come to be involved with the Code for All? And what was that kind of piece of work you did that somehow fell out of this strategy report?
Thank you so much, Lena. I mean, building off of this internal strategy work. And I also think on the back of the different social movements that were springing up and evolving at the time, it became important for Code for All Network to dive deep into an analysis of the state of equity and inclusion, and if there were ways in which the core team, as well as the members of the network, were working that could be hindering greater equity and inclusion, And I think there's a bit of that also already alluded to in the earlier conversations, where we might just assume that because it is civic means that by default, equity and inclusion is highlighted and practiced in its most efficient way. But I think that wasn't the case. So I really had come in to lead a research around that to find what those, basically to get to take a pulse of what was happening in the landscape, where there were hindrances or gaps, and also then come up with possible recommendations. It was sort of a mixed method body of work where we started out with text research, and there were a couple of interviews as well. Interviews were directed at people we had considered like experts in equity and inclusion as a topic. Basically, they led that life. But also we wanted to talk to people who have had lived experiences in particularly multicultural organizations to see what their own experiences were navigating the realities of equity and inclusion within the civic tech community. But a big part of the piece of work that we had done was a participatory process that had convened members of the network, representation of members of the network through a 4-part workshop session where we started with examining what were the definitions that we each had for equity and inclusion, diversity, equity and inclusion. And that sort of progressed to where we started to think about stress testing different definitions and experiences, right, to see what sort of sticks and what doesn't. And it moved us to a stage where we started to analyze the cost. So if we wanted to like reinforce our systems and beliefs and understandings of what equity and inclusion was, what was the cost, you know? And the final piece of the workshop was coming up with a strategy. So this is kind of the process that we led. I think for me, particularly, just in the spirit of the wow moment, the wow moment for me through this process, because it was also a huge learning, it was a learning journey for me, was coming to the understanding of the relationship between the health of an organization and its pursuit of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think the tendency is that organizations sort of follow through with diversity and equity and inclusion theories and frameworks that are out there in a bit of a mechanical way that is sort of broad sweeping. And it does backfire. It becomes detrimental to the health of the organization. And it's almost as if it's a balancing act. And if you maybe haven't had a chance to like think about it very closely, there is a tendency for people to say, of course, we just want all diversity, all equity, all, you know, like going into the extreme end. But the reality is that the more diversity you have, the more complex it becomes to actually like, balance things out. And it just then begins to tell on the health of the organization. And I think it was almost as though to say, do not hire who you can. And this is me just like putting out there. It's not where it hasn't been scrutinized in all depth, right? But it's almost as if it was saying, do not hire people you cannot give equitable experiences to, basically, right? Or at least if you're going to hire and you know where, you should be aware of where the disparities are, where you're not being equitable enough, right? And be able to communicate that and communicate the constraints that you're experiencing that is hindering you from delivering that sort of equitable experience, rather than like assuming things are equitable when they are not. So that for me was like, you know, a huge takeaway. There's a lot more that is in the report that we would unveil in its time. So just stick around and you will hear more about it. And lastly, before I shut up, there is a playbook that comes with this report because the participants of the workshop also sort of developed and came up with 3 tools that could help organizations to better work upon their state and equity DNA. So basically, running a DNA test on the degree of equity within the organization. There is an equity triangle as well. The equity triangle sort of helps you to play a bit of a tension game between inclusion, power, and equity, right? So how inclusive are you? And what's the state of power play within the organization? And what's the equity experiences that people have? And lastly, it's the equity programming. The equity programming basically starts to help you look into the core practices, the operations, to say, are there parts of this where we are not as equitable as we would desire, and what might we do? Thank you so much, Lena.
Fantastic, Nonso. That's a wonderful lead into what sort of we wanted to close on, which was around, just reflecting back to everyone or sharing with everyone some of the things that were created along the way, which were created for the network. So there was the work which happened, the strategy work. We didn't, like as you saw in that how might we statement, it wasn't necessarily about like investigating power, but the power dynamics kind of came out in a couple of different ways, led onto the equity and inclusion piece. And Nonso, I'm guessing when you were referring to the social movements, you were sort of talking about the Black Lives Movement matter and this sort of more focus on that. That was sort of the context of when your work kicked off?
Yes, that was it.
Yeah, which was, what a moment to be looking into all of this. And so from the strategy piece of work, some of the things that we created were, firstly, there's that report, which if you're part of the Code for All network, your organization will have access to that report. And in it, it has these sort of 10 observations about the network. Along the way, and this is all kind of contained in that report, we created one-pager plain language explainers about the network, about the key players within the network. So the network members, the network funders, and the core team. We provided one or two pager on the actual core team setup, because it was part of the confusion around roles and responsibilities came from a lack of understanding of exactly the reality of the Code for All core team. And the report itself contains a process that a networked organization can take to essentially apply an emergent strategy approach to their work. So we were just sort of, in a way, fortunate that there was this moment in time where things were so chaotic that we kind of needed to come up with a new way of finding, direction. And as it happens, the method or the process we came up with, I was looking back at it and I'm like, oh, I would run this with another, now that I know what the process is, because we sort of worked it out as we went, I would absolutely pick it up and run the same process with another organization now. So again, that's another resource. It sort of serves as a bit of a playbook in terms of, if you want to do strategy in a way that breaks from the traditional structured ways, here is an approach you might want to take. And there was, lots of like fun reading in the back of that report as well. So concepts like source, concepts like using metaphors to help you understand what, direction you want to go through. We did initiative mapping using this concept of source. So we ended up with this like ginormous bubble diagram containing lots of bubbles, which just sort of showed the lineage and the heritage of the different projects. Like, where did that project come from? Oh, it was related to that project. Or where did that project come from? And so we sort of mapped out all of the work that the Code for All core team were doing in this, showing where the ideas had sprung from. So it starts to show you the influence that specific people have, because they were the people who came up with some of the bigger ideas. Is there anything more, Lauren or Sophia or Nonso, you'd like to share about about this work and about kind of this working off power dynamics within the network? And then we'll see if there's any questions from folk.
And you would share also that as part of the deliverables, there are some that, as you mentioned, that are more tangible, but I think there are things that weren't as tangible, or I don't know, not at the moment, but I think another thing I can think of as an outcome of all of this was, our focus on new programs and our willingness of exploring new things and new projects. And I think that helped us a lot, because we used to have only like 1 year grant from NED, which was one of our main funders. And after that work, we wrote a proposal for a 2-year grant with different projects and challenging and like proposing new ideas and new things to work on. And that turned out really well. So we moved more into like doing more capacity building. We moved more onto like reflecting on, okay, are the projects that we're funding actually like functioning, or is it just like, is something also that you mentioned in the report, like the focus on developing instead of maintenance. So it's not that we have already evaluated everything and that we still need to figure out things on how to evaluate our projects better, right? And that's a conversation that it's still going. But I think it was, like trying to ask ourselves also, like, is this actually working, or should we move our focus into more capacity building, onto making the member organizations more robust and more efficient on their work? And I think that was definitely one of the outcomes. And also that led to having Nonso in the team as a fundraising and collaboration partner and coordinator and so on. So for me, that was something that came out also from all of this work that we did. And that's something I'm really thankful for.
Lauren, any kind of final thoughts on anything else that kind of, having explored or become aware of power dynamics in the network, that's kind of shifted, your sense of your work or your contribution or the team's place in the network?
I'm not sure. I think we've definitely felt more confident diving into trying to sort of reassess the governing structure, and that's something that we're still working on now. And yeah, one thing, not specifically about what you said, but one thing I really liked about the process of this work was I liked that it didn't end with like specific recommendations, but that it was more about empowering us to be able to come up with sort of those recommendations ourselves. Yeah, really liked that.
That was also my favorite bit because it was such a non-consulting thing. And, there was a tense moment. Well, I mean, it wasn't really that tense. I mean, there was a moment when, one of our stakeholders who was funding the work was asking for recommendations. And yeah, the three of you, I didn't even have to say anything. So yeah, yourself, Lauren and Sophia and Kelly just jumped in and defended why my report didn't have recommendations. And I just felt, okay, my job here is done. So yeah, that was very satisfying. Okay, well, that's what we wanted to share about the work we did, the observations we found. That report, as I mentioned, if you're part of the Code for All network, you can have access to that report. And I believe Nonso's work is going to be, or the equity and inclusion work is going to be shared. If you are on the Code for All Slack, we will be sharing some links to some of the things we've been talking about in the Summit channel on the Slack. And I have just realized that I'm possibly failing at my facilitator duties here. I don't have the final set of words, and I'm not sure if you're doing that on the panels, but just that final set of words with some links to the Code for All Slack. Yeah, I just realized I don't actually have that on me. So
don't worry, I can take care of that.
Okay, thank you. If you wouldn't mind, popping that down. And we have, a couple of minutes for questions, comments. You can use the Q&A function. I mean, there's not that many of us on this live session, so you can also drop them into the chat. But if you have any particular questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. I mean, I would love to hear more from Nonso, to be honest. So let's see as the questions come through. But yeah, Nonso, there's like, I feel like there's just like a bit more that you could, there's a bit more there around like what you discovered along the way that I'd love to hear about. We'll see if any questions come through.
Yeah, I might jump in very quickly as well here. I think just like very related to the power conversation and also picking up from your session yesterday, I think something that we stumbled upon was the extent to which the articulation of power can be imprecise. So it's basically like
oh dear.
Oh, we just
oh no. No, I mean, he's sharing something so magnificent. Oh, Nonso, we lost you just as you were about to say something quite profound. So we lost you at like the articulation of power is quite imprecise.
Oh my God. Okay, thanks. Yeah. So I was saying that the way power is articulated, at least within the civic tech space, and I think maybe more broadly, is imprecise. And that's kind of why I was really excited with your presentation yesterday, where you sort of shared this like the different expressions or different manifestations of power, the social status, the social identity, the personal, historical, and all of that was kind of interesting. And why the conversations during the equity and inclusion work sort of hit on power was because there's a lot of tension and desire to see power shift. But then there was also people pointing out the fact that you don't just shift power, because power exists where it does for a reason. There's a function that is attached to power, and that's why often sometimes it does sit where it does. And so if we do not like have this very nuanced conversation about why power exists where it does in the first place, the process of shifting it is just going to be mere rhetorics where we just say shift power. But what exactly is this substance, if it were a substance, that we want to move from point A to B, right? And so I found, yeah, that's again, going back to the presentation yesterday, where it's like, oh, this ability to like disaggregate what we mean when we speak the word power, it's like a first step to shifting it at all, if we might or could, right? And so, yeah, and I hope that the work when it comes out would prompt people to like less use this compressed version of power, which sometimes is like really just looking at the seat of authority or like the position that is really out there, to the different nuances that could like make it more feasible for these new realities that we seek to be attained.
Amazing. Thanks, Nonso. Question from Joe, which I think picks up really nicely from there. Are there any threads of work you'd like to build on from here? And a great way Joe has put it, what rocks are left unturned? So are there any threads of work you'd like to build on from here? And for you, what rocks are left unturned?
Do you want me to take that, Lauren? I think definitely, I think that we're still working on, and Lauren mentioned it before, is our governing structure. If we had a board meeting, we had the first board meeting as co-directors on July, and in there we started the conversations around, okay, let's rethink our governing structure and propose a new one that functions best for both the members and ourselves as a core team. So I would put that as a thread of work, something that we want to focus on. Also focus a lot on the affiliation process and the difference between the members. We have governing members, affiliate members, but it's not really clear on how each of these two categories are built. So analyzing that, and that doesn't mean that it necessarily is going to change, but it's like analyzing this and say, okay, where did it come from? I think that's another line of work. And another thing that we have been discussing and thinking around, it's been a lot around research, more than funding implementations of tech or other projects, trying to build on for more research that gives us more knowledge and clarity, and also something that can speak broader of the civic tech network and not only of like the Code for All network. Which rocks are left unturned? I don't know. I think there are still many, and I think there's some of them that we haven't figured out yet and that we haven't discovered. And I think that we're going to discover a lot as we move forward, especially with the governing structure. Yeah.
Thank you. Lauren, what threads are you seeing that could be picked up, or what rocks are left unturned?
I think Sophia mostly covered it. Yeah, I'll pop back in if I think of something.
No worries. Thank you. And for everybody watching either live or later on, for the core team to be taking on this question about the governance structure is a really big, messy, rocky, I mean, it's kind of huge, because it's sort of talking about how are the members formally in relation to each other, which in part talks to like the formal bonds that exist that create this thing as a network. And there's all sorts of implications that fall out of the sort of governance structure that collectively that they land on. So no small feat. It's a pretty big deal to be revisiting the governance structure of a network, and especially one like civic tech, where there are real diversity of views and opinions. Thank you so much, Sophia, for popping that additional information. Summit continues on for the rest of the week. There are some really fantastic sessions on, hopefully in your time zone. There's a link there to the full program, recording on YouTube. The Code for All Slack is where all of the kind of presentations and additional resources are being shared. It's an open Slack. Come and join us there. There's a Summit channel. Mailing list, twice a month you'll be getting a very informative newsletter, which I enjoy reading, so I assume you will enjoy reading. And of course, we would love to hear your feedback on this session. We are pretty much on time, so if there's any sort of final questions, you're out of time, pop them, join us on Slack, we'll answer them there. Thank you all so much, Lauren, Sophia, Mar as well. Thank you for hanging out with us, and Nonso. Wishing you all the very, very best with wherever this work next goes, and looking forward to seeing that toolkit come out. Thanks all.
Thank you
so much.
Lena.
Thank you all, and thanks everyone who joined us. Thanks,
Bye.
Joe.